Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Robo Papers. Super glad to have Ritvik Singh with us today. He is one of the authors of this paper called DextrAH-RGB, Visuomotor Policies to Grasp Anything with Dexterous Hands. Thank you so much for making the time, Ritvik. It's great to have you. Maybe as a start, if you can share a little bit about yourself, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you for having me. My name is Ritvik. I'm currently a researcher at NVIDIA in the Dexterity group, and I'll also be starting my PhD this fall at UC Berkeley. And I'm excited to share some of the work that we've been doing on like visuomotor control for dexterous manipulation, and more specifically the DextrAH-RGB paper. Yeah, so when talking about some of the work that we do, a big question we always get is, why do we even care about robot hands in the first place? And, we've already seen specialized robots in factory environments. But now what we really want to focus on is generalized robots that can work in human environments. And so if we look at this, like, our hands are what humans use for interacting with our environments. And so the environments are actually designed around, human morphologies, such as the handle of a jug or a doorknob. And so while factory robots, you have like the factory, built around like the robot embodiment, here it stands to reason that anthropomorphic robots it can more seamlessly interact within the human environments. And I just wanted to give a very small video from a paper called Hato, where they try to do this task of pouring a wine bottle. And they try this with parallel jaw grippers, and you can see that the bottle just slips out of the grippers. Whereas here, they'll try it with robot hands. And here it's able to, envelop the bottle and maintain a force closure so that it doesn't slip out of the hands and successfully complete the task.
This was Toru. This is one of our first episodes. Okay, yeah. All right. Okay, yeah. Nice.
And so that's sort of the motivation behind why we are very interested in robot hands. But on the other side, I think it's also important to just quickly motivate why we care about RGB in the first place. And so one of the reasons is that depth sensors can be incredibly noisy. And so you can get like holes in your depth maps, or if there's highly reflective objects, or if there's a lot of light in the scene that washes out the IR maps, these can cause extra noise in the depth maps, as well as there's a bit more information with RGB in the sense of if you have like semantic differences you see between the different objects, which might not be so clear with depth in cluttered scenes. And then also, I think in the future, we're seeing a lot of different works trying to, leverage internet scale data of, humans interacting with objects. And a lot of this data is in the form of RGB frames. And so it'd be easier to then, use a policy that, works natively in RGB as opposed to having to use a depth-based policy. And so with that, with the motivation done, I'd like to present our work, DextrAH-RGB. And so in this work, we do end-to-end RGB-based grasping. It can work with either stereo RGB or and it's able to grasp arbitrary objects. And one of the things I'd like to note for the rest of the video is that all of the videos are not sped up, so they're at 1x speed. And also, all of the objects are unseen during training time. And so
it really is impressively fast for that, actually. That's a good thing to point out. That's nice. All right.
So actually, the very next couple slides are actually going to talk about how we were able to get it so like fast and smooth. So one of the when we're designing policies for such highly articulated systems, they have several design requirements. It has to obviously complete the task of dexterous grasping, but it also has to be able to avoid collisions with the environment, avoid collisions with itself, handle any hardware joint limits, and also perform some degree of redundancy resolution as it's an overactuated system. And so we use a technique called geometric fabrics, which was created by some of our colleagues at NVIDIA. And what this does at a high level is that it exposes an action space that can handle all the non-task related objectives so that the policy only has to focus on the task at hand. This is sort of similar to how you can think of this as like a similar in vein to how people might use a end effector pose as your action space so that the robot doesn't have to necessarily reason about the forward kinematics. And so what geometric fabrics does is that, we're able to expose this action space. And so the action space that we use is the palm pose and the fingertip actions. And so just to take a bit of an aside.
What is a fingertip action, like the joint state, you mean?
Yeah, so I'm actually just about to get to that because we don't actually specify the joint state. So for the fingertip actions, one of the things that we were inspired by was looking at, this set of works about grasp taxonomies and how, the set of grasps that humans use for picking up objects, they all have some sort of underlying structure. And so from here, we hypothesized then that the set of all feasible grasps lies on a lower dimensional manifold. And so what we do is we don't actually command the full 16 joints on the hand directly. Instead, what we do is we command a 5-dimensional reduced PCA action space for the hand. Now, in the limit, this is limiting as it isn't fully expressive of all the possible motions for the robot hand. However, we find that for grasping, it is able to produce like a sufficient action space for grasping various objects. And so the way we design this action space is we use the DexYCV data set, which contains a set of trajectories of humans grasping objects. And it contains like the annotated human hand pose. From there, what we do is we retarget these human hand poses to the Allegro hand. Then what we do is, so now we have a set of retargeted trajectories. And then what we can do is, depending on the size of the object, we can either shape the trajectory to form a precision grasp by optimizing the fingertips to reach a point that's in the middle of all of them, or try to create a power grasp in which all of the fingertips try to reach a point that is on the palm. And then with this, we now have a set of trajectories that contains, precision grasps and power grasps. And then what we can do is we can perform PCA on these sets of trajectories to get a PCA space for the joint angles. And one of the things we find is that 98% of the variance can be explained by the first 5 principal components. So the way that geometric fabrics works then is that our policy will output the desired 6-DOF pose of the palm as well as a PCA target. Then what the geometric fabrics does is it runs a low-level controller to optimize the joint angles of the robot to ensure that the palm pose matches that of the policy's output. And also it'll optimize the joint angles of the hand such that the PCA representation of the hand matches that policy. And so here's an example of geometric fabrics in simulation. And so we have kind of bubble wrapped this robot with collision spheres. And what we're doing in this video is we're just applying random actions to the robot. And we can see that it's able to avoid collisions with the environment, which we specify a priori. And it's also able to avoid self-collisions while also ensuring that it maintains a relatively neutral pose that is conducive to grasping. And so here's an example of geometric fabrics in the real world. And so what we're doing right now is we're literally commanding the fabrics to go below the table to essentially try to crash into the table. And what the fabrics does is as you get closer to the table, it'll sort of like dampen out the system to try to prevent the robot from colliding with the table. And we do this to really ensure the safety of the whole robot system.
And you're saying that it's also interesting to me that the palm and the fingers are almost like ready to grasp. Is that its natural state because of the way?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not like the other way around or like, yeah.
Yeah. So like part of the geometric fabrics, like we can specify different types of, nominal behaviors for the robot. And one of them is the like resting, like the posture, like the resting state of the robot when we're not like perturbing it. And so we choose a resting state such that like the hands are like ready to grasp an object on the table.
Sorry, I have one more question about earlier on when you talk about so your 5-dimensional PCA was very inspired by this kind of like topology or taxonomy of like different grasp structures. Is that 5 related to roughly the 5 layers from that tree of grasping from the 1989 paper? Yeah, this one.
Yeah. So no, the 5 is primarily just what we did because it was able to explain like most of the variants, and we wanted
I see.
to have a relatively
I see.
less complex action space because it just makes the RL easier.
Okay, got it.
There was also another reason why we did the action space, and it was because one of the things we found was that in training, if you don't use the so this was this was actually found from like a previous work like DextrAH-RGB, which did this task of grasping with depth. And one of the things they found was if you don't use like the PCA action space and you just use the joint targets, you end up getting weird behaviors where, let's say, like the robot tries to grasp it like this, where like, like the 2 fingers are doing like a relatively like non-physical grasp that is only possible in simulation, but doesn't transfer well at all in reality. And so a lot of the types of, grasps, like the precision and power graphs that we were able to get from the PCA space also really help the sim to real transfer.
Gotcha. So in effect, the PCA space is constraining it to physically grasp trajectories in addition. Okay, interesting.
And so now moving on to the training pipeline, we want to train these, visual policies, but one of the key bottlenecks is that, visual RL can be pretty sample inefficient. And so what we do is we do like the classic like 2-stage pipeline where we train a state-based teacher policy with reinforcement learning. And then we distill this into an RGB-based student policy. That way, most of the sample inefficiency is sort of limited to just like state-based learning, and all the vision-based learning is more or less like supervised. And so before going into the whole training setup, I'll just like quickly go through like the teacher architecture. So we have an LSTM that's followed by an MLP. And the reason we use LSTMs is because in general, any policy that can take in history, it's able to have like better sim for real because it will do some form of implicit system identification. However, one of the things is that LSTMs are known to have less stable training. So one of the tricks that we adopt is to just have concatenated skip connections. So this is like similar to DenseNet, which improves stability as well as top-level policy performance and training speed. And there was like a paper a couple of years back called DenseNet, which noticed like a similar thing about how like, these dense connections can help like stabilize the RL learning. And then in terms of the objects that we choose to grasp, we use the visual dexterity dataset, which contains 140 objects with challenging geometry. And I'll get into the future slides how we are able to make sure that we get like RGB like textures for these. And then lastly, one of the things is that when we train policies in simulation, a lot of the times we apply domain randomization to physics parameters in order to facilitate sim to real transfer. The idea being that if we have a whole range of parameters for like, things like friction or joint stiffness and damping, then hopefully the real world value will lie somewhere in between. And so we can get good sim to real transfer. And so one of the things is that, the wider you can make the range, the more robust the policy will be. However, if you make the range too wide, then policy learning actually becomes way too challenging because the policy will just try to take very conservative actions, and it'll actually have a really difficult time exploring the space. And so to get around this, what we do is we use a trick called automatic domain randomization. I think this was like first created by like OpenAI back in their shadow hand Rubik's Cube paper. And in this one, basically the way it works is that for various physics parameters, we adaptively increase the domain randomization ranges. So the way it works is that for every physics parameter, let's say friction, it'll start with an initial value, which is pi init here. And then we also specify terminal ranges. So the lower range and then it's like the lower end. Then what we do is we use a success metric, which in our case is just the percentage of objects that are able to be grasped. And once the policy is sufficiently performant, which in our case is just if 40% of the objects are able to be successfully grasped, we then linearly increment this range towards the terminal ranges. And so the idea here is that it naturally induces a curriculum where at the beginning of training, the task is fairly easy. And so the agent is able to explore and it's able to learn and get reward. But then as it starts becoming more and more performant, we then widen these ranges in order to make the task more difficult and also into real transfer.
Yes.
So we randomize like a lot of different physics parameters, and they can be broadly just categorized in terms of the robot physics parameters, the object physics parameters, and the policy observation parameters. And so even though like we're not directly using like the teacher is not being used in the real world, having it reason about the noisy observations allows better distillation into like the students.
Sorry, so the teacher does not have this randomization, or it does?
Sorry, it does.
The teacher does. Okay.
Yeah. So the idea is that if your teacher has like perfect information, then it's going to be very difficult for your students to actually distill the teacher into the student, because the student may not know like why the teacher took a certain action. And this is like the case if you have like, like basically like perfect information. To give like a concrete example, we found that if we provide like object velocity information,
Gotcha.
that was like a really privileged observation that like we would have difficulty distilling those behaviors into a vision-based policy. And so it's also helpful to have like noisy observations as well, because then it makes distillation into like vision policies, which are, inherently noisy in terms of their observations. It makes that a bit easier.
Makes sense. Okay. One other question. I'm always curious about this. How sensitive are these? Like, how long did it take for you to tune to figure out these ranges and the correct scale for your curriculum to increase in difficult, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. And so I think in general, the ranges they're not super sensitive, just because like if your terminal ranges are too wide, then like, and that means that then maybe like your policy won't be able to reach that. Then like you just know that you can like decrease it more. And so I think like the key thing is just making sure that you allow it to have like a fairly wide range. In general, we found that like things such as, I think like it also varies depending on the parameter as well. So for example, like with like friction, we were able to like randomize the ranges between -10 and 10, which is like very non-physical. And I think, and I'm not entirely sure what the physics simulator is actually doing in the back end for that. But I think like maybe like there's some sort of a clipping to ensure that it doesn't get like too crazy. It wasn't like too sensitive to that. But then like other things such as like contact friction or like mass, those were like quite sensitive. Like you can't really, you can't really make the objects like too heavy. Like that really like, I guess like impacts like sim to real transfer, which I guess like makes sense. Like for example, with mass, like your Allegro hand only has so much like payload that it can do. And so like you're trying to like, if in simulation, it's trying to lift like a 5 kilogram object, it might send actions that are not really feasible.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
And then so for a reward function, I'll just like quickly go through this. We just have 4 terms. The first term encourages the hand to get close to the object. The second term encourages the object to be lifted vertically into the air. The third term ensures that the object reaches a specific point in the air and isn't just like flung in order to satisfy the lifting reward. And the last term is more of a regularization term, which prevents the fingers from curling too much to the point where like they can't even grasp the object. Sorry. And so putting all of this together, this is our teacher training pipeline. We use an asymmetric actor-critic variant of PPO, where our critic receives privileged clean states because there's no sim to real transfer. It's just providing the PPO update. And then we provide the noisy state observations to the teacher, as mentioned before, because noisy state observations ensure that it's easier to distill into a vision-based policy. And so what we provide is like the standard like proprioceptive observations like joint velocity, joint position. And then we also provide a one-hot vector corresponding to the class of one of the 140 objects. And then the output, which is just the action, like the hand pose and the PCA space, gets fed into the underlying geometric fabric, which then outputs PD targets into the simulator.
Why do you provide the object class?
Our idea of providing the object class was that hopefully maybe for like different objects, it could do different types of
Sorry, yeah. Sorry, I just forgot. This is the teacher. They can't see it. Okay, never mind. All right, yeah, okay.
I should have mentioned also, I completely forgot to mention, we also provide the object position and like the object pose as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
And so moving on to the student architecture, what we do is we basically have an encoder, which can take the left and right image, and it outputs an embedding. And then we concatenate that embedding with the proprioceptive observations and feed that into an LSTM and then an MLP. And so one of the things is we chose to use stereo RGB as it allows for implicit depth inference. And in simulation, we did some ablations with stereo RGB versus monocular RGB, and we found that stereo was actually able to outperform the monocular variants. And then we use the same thing about how we use like, the dense connections. And then lastly, we also add an auxiliary loss for predicting the object position. So this is pretty useful, one, just to like debug like our sim to real issues, I think. And the other reason why it's helpful is because we use a state machine to do like bin packing. And I'll get into the details of the state machine in a few slides. So here is the architecture of our stereo encoder. So around the time that DextrAH-RGB, like we were working on this, there was another line of like work in the 3D vision community for like 3D for like like stereo completion, Duster, and then like they had like follow-up works like Master and so on. And they performed, they showed like really promising results for being able to reconstruct 3D scenes. And so we adopted a similar architecture as Duster. So the way our architecture works is that we use a pre-trained ResNet that's fine-tuned during distillation, and the left and right images are fed into this ResNet in a Siamese manner. And then we chop off the last layer of the ResNet. So then basically like the second last layer, we reshape it and then we downsample it into 128 tokens, each 128 tokens each, which is 128 dimensional. And then we feed in the tokens from the left image and right image into the transformer encoder. And we also feed a learnable embedding token. This is similar to how with like VIT, there's like a learnable class token that you would feed in, and then you would use the output of the learnable class token for your classification because you didn't want to bias for any one particular token. So similarly here, we use the output of our learnable embedding token as our stereo embedding. And in our transformer encoder, we use a similar type of setup as what Duster used, where they use cross attention between the tokens of the left image and the right image. So here, the tokens of the left image can only attend to the embedding token and the tokens in the right image and vice versa. So this is to provide some sort of like implicit stereo matching. And so here's an example of the stereo input that's fed to the policy. One thing that just might seem a bit weird that I'll just address is that we have like a landscape for we have portrait views. The reason is because we wanted to we use like 2 Intel RealSense cameras, and we wanted to try to mimic the stereo baseline that a single like depth camera on the Intel RealSense has, which is 55 millimeters. But it was like a lot easier to like mount it vertically than horizontally. So it's just a matter of like how we chose to mount the cameras. And so as mentioned for the teacher training, we used the visual dexterity data set because it has a lot of good meshes that are useful for grasping, but they don't come with any textures. And so in order to get around this, we do like possibly just like the dumbest thing, which is we get a bunch of random textures and we just randomly bind of like everyday objects, and we just like randomly bind them onto the meshes. And so while the textures don't necessarily semantically match, so a classic example I like to give is like a teddy bear that has the texture of a Tide Pod. We find that the objects look realistic enough to facilitate good sim to real transfer. And so when doing our student training, we use we do like various types of randomizations. So we do like rendering randomizations to like the materials of the robot and the object and the table in order to increase the diversity of of images seen. But then also we apply runtime data augmentations. So one of them is that, like, we only have a limited number of dome light textures, and so we also sometimes will like composite like a random background from like the Coco data set. Another one also is that with the simulator, we're not able to get motion blur, which is something that we get a lot in the real world. And so randomly, we might just add like a random motion blur kernel in order to simulate some of the artifacts in the real world. And so putting all this together, we get our student training pipeline where where at every step, we take 2 sets of observations, one for the teacher and one for the student. So the teacher receives the observations that we mentioned before, and the student receives the proprioception and the stereo pair. And then we supervise the student to output the same actions as the teacher. And then also what we do is we supervise the student to output the object position from the simulator. And then crucially, we have the student actions that get fed back into the simulator so that you don't avoid like covariate shift problems with, like, let's say if we were to do like standard BC. There's like one small point that I wanted to make about the student distillation loss. And so like I've noticed like some works, they'll use an L2 objective for the action. We, on the other hand, we use a KL divergence loss. And we find that the KL divergence actually is able to improve policy performance by 5% versus L2. The reason is as follows. We use like fixed variance policies. And so what that means is that when we distill like our teacher policy into our student policy, the variance doesn't change with respect to any of the observations. And so the teacher's variance is like trivial to, like, the student is able to trivially match the teacher's variance because you're basically just copying the parameters. And so because we use the fixed variance and we also have diagonal Gaussians, the KL loss actually reduces to this expression over here, which is a non-isotropic squared loss, where we weigh each dimension of the action space by the inverse variance. And just to give some like visual intuition of isotropic versus non-isotropic squared losses, on the left here, in the contour plot, we have an isotropic loss whereby basically the optimization objective is prioritizing both dimensions equally. Whereas for the non-isotropic squared loss, we can see that at the beginning, we're really trying to drive the loss down along the dimension of lower variance. The intuition being that if a certain dimension has lower variance, then we tolerate less then we just intuitively tolerate less deviation from the mean. And so we want to, really tighten that up. But then for other dimensions that have larger variances, we tolerate more of a deviation because it's not as important to optimize that right away. And so bringing it together, we have our we have our real world deployment. So what we do is we use our trained student policy and we feed it the DextrAH-RGB pair from the real world, as well as proprioception. And then one of the things that we do is for our bin packing demo, we use a state machine. So basically what'll happen is the student will output where it thinks the object is. And if the object is on the table, then the state machine will run the RL policy in order to grasp the object up into the air. But once the object is sufficiently lifted, and so the student predicts its position to be higher up, then it'll switch. The state machine will then switch to do a hard-coded command to just like deposit, to just like move the arm and deposit it into the bin.
Makes sense.
And so here's just an example of the video I think I showed at the beginning of our state machine. Basically, like, our co-author Carl is placing random objects on the table, and the robot is able to pick it up and then deposit it into the bin. One of the things we also really wanted to test out is how robust is our policy to perturbations. So we tried two types of perturbations. One is like physical and one is visual. So here with these physical perturbations, Carl is moving the object around, and we can see that the robot is able to track the object. And I think towards the end, it's Carl's not fast enough, and it ends up depositing it into the into. The second one, we wanted to try a visual perturbation. So how does the policy work when we remove the light blocking board? So we have sunlight is streaming into the camera, is degrading the depth. And then also like Anker is like moving the calibration board and trying to like, like perturb it and get in the way of the robot. And it's still for the most part able to carry out the task of depositing the object into the bin.
Yeah.
And so we conducted like several ablations. One of them was monocular versus stereo. And so one of the things we found was that the monocular policies performed worse in simulation than the stereo policies. And one of the things also was like in the real world, we found that the monocular policies were a lot more hesitant than the stereo policies. And I think this is like an interesting result because there have been like some like studies in neuroscience which show that like, humans, we can manipulate objects with like one eye closed, but we'll do it a bit slower. And that was something that we sort of saw with the monocular variants as well. The other thing we also saw was that the sort of like stereo encoder, like the cross attention mechanism, actually helped to also boost performance in simulation. And we tried to like control for this by like not using the extra, by not using the transformer, but then increasing the number of parameters in the policy to ensure that it's not just improving because of extra parameters. And we found that like, there is some usefulness of the transformer specifically.
So since we're on the stereo or since you mentioned it being more hesitant, I'm curious about the KL divergence thing and how that relates, because like part of that's uncertainty, right? So did you notice anything with the dimensions that it allowed more variance in, like any patterns or any interesting?
That's actually, I actually I didn't investigate that, but that would be
right.
Interesting. But actually, now that I think about it, so the actual variance of the policies, like it's trying to learn the distribution from the teacher. And because the distribution, the teacher has like fixed variance, whether it's monocular or stereo, when you're distilling it, it'll basically just copy the variance like almost exactly. So
because the teacher isn't using that, so it won't be the same.
Right.
Okay, but does the teacher learn anything useful then? Or does the teacher learn any interesting patterns? Like I would expect like basically the world Z to be more variance or something. Like,
yeah, so I actually don't recall which dimensions it was, but I do recall significant, I guess, like variance in the like differences in the sigmas. Like okay. I think my understanding, if I recall correctly, like there was a lot more variance in the I think there's a lot more variance in the pose, whereas like there was like less variance in the finger.
That makes sense.
But yeah, like there was definitely like a huge variety in like log sigmas that was output from the teacher.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Makes sense. Yeah. Because
Okay. So I guess like like for just like overall takeaways, one of the things we found is that like simulation and RL really allowed us to scale up a data collection to complete these complex tasks, and doing like randomizations both in terms of physics parameters and like visual randomizations really allowed for generalization. But there's also future directions that we'd like to take this work. One of the things is that our grasps, as you may have noticed, are not really functional. Like they're mainly just to grasp the object and deposit it. It's not really doing something like pouring the cup, or in this video on the right, the complex task of actually operating a drill. One of the examples I like to give is like sometimes when we would put like a pot, on the table, the policy would try to pick it up from like opening, like the round part of the pot rather than the handle. And so I think like in the future, it'd be quite useful to incorporate human data to try to learn these more like functional manipulation tasks. The other thing is that we have this like student teacher distillation pipeline, But one of the downsides is that like the objects aren't like the policies aren't very vision aware. And so an example is like, for example, is like if your policy doesn't know to like manipulate the object such that the object is like visible to the cameras so that it can like not block it. And so in the future, being able to do maybe like, end-to-end RL could make the policies a bit more vision aware.
Could you like start fine tuning from the trained student policy or something? Okay, all right, that's the
So
kind of thing you're talking
so
about.
that was actually So we have some. So I think our follow-up work, which we're going to release in like the coming months, is actually to address some of these issues.
Gotcha.
And one of the reasons why, like we, for example, when we did the distillation, technically you could have just done distillation on the muse, on like just the output from the teacher, and like that's it. But we deliberately chose to do distillation and like keep the teacher's like sigma as well as mu, so that it would facilitate potential like fine tuning down the line. And so this is sort of it for the presentation. One of the things I wanted to also quickly show was we were able to then, so we demonstrated this on the KUKA Allegro, but we also then started a collaboration with Boston Dynamics to implement DextrAH onto their BD eAtlas robot. And so we were able to then get a nice demo where we were able to see like grasping on both like the right arm and the left arm of various like industrial objects. And we can see like then like we have like the camera, which is in the head, tracks the policy prediction of where the object is and deposits it in the bin. So it was a nice follow-on work to DextrAH-RGB that we were able to get.
Yeah, so this actually answers maybe potentially a couple of questions I wanted to ask earlier. So I was going to ask like how sensitive is it? So you did a bunch of perturbation, but I wonder what if you're in the real world when you try to do the safety real test, if the cameras are like slightly further away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but in this case, I mean, literally the robot is turning his head, so I presume you can do that quite easily.
Well, so I mean, to be fair, in this case, we also make sure to simulate that the robot, so basically here, the robot moves its head by looking at the policies, the policy we have our auxiliary head, and then the robot makes sure to look at that prediction. So we can like get this in simulation. But I think you bring up an important point. So what we do is we try to randomize a little bit like the intrinsics and the extrinsics of the camera. So we try to like jitter it a bit to make it a bit more robust to that. But we don't just like completely randomize like the viewpoint of like, is it viewing it from the like, for example, in like the DextrAH-RGB case, is it viewing it like face on versus like from the versus like up versus like from the side? We don't do that. And so it definitely would not generalize to that sort of use case. And so I think that's another interesting thing about, can it just generalize to any sort of viewpoints of the scene?
Is there any reason why you guys choose to put the cameras like, I guess, from a so-called third-person view? Have you considered like putting a wrist camera?
Oh, a wrist camera. Yeah, I think we just did this because I think it was just like the easiest one to do, to not have like the cameras like move too much. But I think wrist mounted definitely makes sense for future work. I don't think we did too much investigation in terms of like the position of where we put the cameras. We just tried to get something that looked fairly reasonable for the policy to be able to pick objects up.
I imagine like if you, let's say, in addition to the stereo camera that you have, if you put a couple more wrist cameras, I mean, the whole pipeline probably don't have to change at all, right? I mean, you just learn just more inputs, that's all. Yeah. And I suppose for you to then do this follow-on work with the Boston Dynamic guys, the only thing you change in your pipeline is just the retargeting in the very first step, right? To, go from
like the action space? Yeah. So we use like a different action space for the robot because it's like different hands.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think that's the neat thing about all this like really end-to-end stuff. Like once you get it working, you don't have to change too much. And I imagine you can put like literally 10 cameras if you can. Like, but wrist camera is the easiest, right? Because you know, just step on the wrist. It's probably will learn a lot more.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of also like interesting things you could do with like wrist cameras in the future with like more like active vision. Like if you've got like really cluttered, like one thing is like, as you can tell, like the table is quite clean. But if we had like super cluttered scenes, then like you could have like your robot be able to control like where the like camera is able to look and be able to develop some sort of like internal representation of the scene and manipulate it. Yeah.
That would make your
don't just use it
student-teacher
for
training harder, though, right?
Yeah. Sorry?
That would make your student-teacher training a lot harder, though, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a big reason why I'm interested in like now investigating like the end-to-end RL part.
Makes sense. Yeah.
Because you can't like fundamentally with the student-teacher distillation, you're trying to learn state-based behaviors into a vision policy, but the most natural way is to learn vision behaviors for a vision policy.
Right. Because the state-based teacher, just because in case anyone is listening and doesn't understand this, because I think we glossed over it, right? It's that the teacher has like, it's noisy, but it is a real pose the object, so it doesn't matter where the camera is at any time when it learns, which means that if you wanted it to learn something like an end effector camera or
and like classic examples of like failure cases we would sometimes have is like if like the arm is like blocking the object, then it's like the state-based teacher just knows immediately to pick up the object. But from the perspective of the student, like this just all of a sudden became multimodal, and it's like unclear why the teacher chose to do that.
Does that often cause failures for you, or is it like if you had to break down the failures, how would you guess if they're distributed? Yeah.
So I think with like this like Kuka Allegro, it's not a big deal just because our cameras are strategically positioned, so to speak, to avoid that. But I think for the E-Atlas, I think that actually becomes much more of a salient difficulty because the camera is like from the bird's eye view. So like the arm will a lot of the time actually get in the way. If you like look at the videos, I urge you to think about like from your own POV, like when you're picking up an object, your hand will get in the way more than like if you had a third person view. As opposed to the failure cases, one of the big failure cases is like with like very, very tiny objects. So like one of the things we tried was like lifting up like a Lego brick. And so there, it'll definitely like struggle a bit to lift that. The other thing also is if it accidentally rolls the object out of view of the camera, and that again is another example of like you're not really learning a vision-based behavior. It's like when it accidentally like knocks the like Tupperware container out of view of the camera, then like it's all bets are off, and it's not really going to be.
Makes sense.
You mentioned in this in your paper, which I think it's also kind of like shown in the table, the success rate table. I think table 2. So you mentioned basically DextrAH-RGB is pretty competitive versus your older work, that the one with depth, but then it's not really uniformly across, right? Especially I think for certain tasks like cleaner, cheese it, like it's could you comment about those? Like what's your intuition around that variance?
So I think like a big part of the variance is that there's a lot of some seeds do better than others, and more specifically, some seeds are much better at picking up the objects than others. So there's a lot of, when doing like sim to real, especially in like our manipulation works, like be it for like the like Dexstream or DextrAH or DextrAH-RGB, we found that there's a huge amount of like variety in like sim to real, where like you'll have like, let's say 5 policies that work perfectly well in simulation, but then only like a couple will, like 1 or 2, maybe 3 will like transfer into the real world. For DextrAH-RGB, we actually are able to get basically all of our policies to transfer perfectly well. But even then, there's a lot of interseed variance in what it's in terms of like what it's good at and for like lifting. And so one of the things is like some of the seeds were actually like 100% on Cheez-It, but then they weren't super good on like the airplane. And so like the best seed that we were able to get just so happened to be worse on the Cheez-It and worse on the cleaner. So it's a bit of an unsatisfying answer, but it's really comes down to like the variance in into real.
Oh, that's interesting.
I wonder if you can do something like a mixture of student experts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
It's almost impossible to, as you say, until you test it in the real world, you may not know. So how do you address that? Like it's the variance. It's in a way quite unsatisfactory if you know that it's actually quite possible to do this end to end. You just that you don't know which particular student is the one for this particular task. So
yeah,
how do you think you can address that?
yeah. I think like the best way is to maybe collect more comprehensive simulation statistics to see because like right now, like the statistics that we like sort of like keep track of are very coarse. Like, what is the overall success rate? Maybe we don't capture like specific like object-based statistics. Like currently, like I couldn't really tell you between C1 versus C2, like which one's better at Cheez-It versus which one's better at, or like which one's better at like object 1 versus which one's better in object 2. And so if we could like get these sort of like, if we could, I think like that would be an interesting thing to look at, because if we could actually find like, you know, in sim, like what, like we could really scrutinize like what objects does it do worse on and what objects does it do better in, then it just naturally follows like your idea of like the mixture of experts and like, you know, distilling multiple teachers depending on the object. That just becomes a very natural thing to do.
Yeah, but I was wondering, or do you think that like how it fails is also an important, because what you described is quite binary, right? You know, with this object, whether this particular student is good or not. But I wonder whether that's like how, even let's say in a successful attempt, you know, but it was barely successful, like the object is dangling, you know, somehow.
Oh, I
right.
see.
And I wonder if there's a maybe you can put a VLM directly in the simulations to give you like more qualitative feedback, but like is there a role there, like, or rather the how it fails also can be put in as a reward, you know, in
Yeah,
the design.
I think that's I think in the future, like that will be, especially as VLMs only improve, that'll be the way forward, because I think one of the difficulties is like, yeah, as you said, like how it's like dangling the object and like things like that. Like maybe you can try to figure out like some like mathematical expression for like what does that actually mean in terms of like a function of the simulator states, but that's not like a super scalable way to go about things. And I think, yeah, having like a VLM almost like provides a sort of like style feedback, like Asp is like kind of brittle and like maybe needs to like envelop it more or something like that. That makes a lot of sense. And I think there have been a lot of interesting works. I think Jason Ma was a guest on your podcast earlier on. I think like, yeah, there's a lot of interesting works with using like, you know, VLMs for for reward and improving it that way.
Yeah. Because I mean the way you were describing some of the failure cases just struck me that it's very hard for the current setup for the student to ever know, like, you know, if the object is out of frame, like what, you know, I don't know what to do, because, you know, the way it's defined for me, it's only when I can see it. But
yeah, and I've seen some works that like also for like the teacher, for example, they would include a reward that would correspond to like what % of the object is visible from like a camera plane. So the teacher kind of learns to manipulate it in a way that's like suitable for the student. But I think like while those like do work, I think it just becomes very difficult to have a lot of these like to shape the teacher behavior to match that of the student. And I think just in general to shape this type of vision aware behavior. And so I think like definitely either like scaling up more so that it'll eventually like learn these just through like, you know, brute force, or by using like VLMs to guide it with the reward.
yeah. I guess you also, sorry, I'm just going through a limitation section. So you mentioned a couple of this already. Any other limitations that you want to highlight, or like that you want to pursue in future work?
Yeah, so I think one of them also is, I mentioned it before, but like the PCA space. It's it's great for the task, but you know, obviously you'd like to ideally be able to use the full dexterity of the hand.
Mhm.
So that's something that would be nice to, you know, really unlock in the future. But I think like the biggest thing for me is the like functional grasping and being able to perform tasks that go beyond just like pick and place and being able to actually like, you know, like if you're like picking up a hammer, making sure you grab it from the handle, not from the end. And like, I really like the example in the slides I had, like of like that one paper that had like the drill, like being able to operate a drill, like that is something that you can really only do with like hands. Really, it's very difficult to really do that with a parallel jaw gripper. You need to grasp it in a very specific way. So being able to do like tool use and, you know, be able to have like these sort of like functional affordances is one of the biggest, both like limitations, but also the biggest things that we're trying to push forward as well.
I mean, you mentioned earlier on, like by having some amount of human data may help you on something of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But are you thinking it's just a very minimal amount of human data, maybe egocentric video, or maybe even at the wrist camera to like how you use the drill and then simulate from there on? So you limit the exploration space with human data first and then do a lot more simulation from there. Is that what you're thinking about when you say adding human data can help with, let's say, using of tools?
Yeah. So I think that I think that's definitely like a really promising option. Like the idea of like if you have like because you have like so much human data, so you can almost like it's like conceivable to think that you could have like a similar recipe with like LLMs where like you just do like vast amounts of pre-training on like human data and then like maybe you need to include some like robot data as well. Otherwise like the embodied like fact like a human hand looks different from a robot hand will might like and then from there being able to, you know, like fine tune in simulation with like, you know, like let's say like being able to actually pick it up, like pick up the drill and stuff. I think that's I think that's like a really promising approach. And then like from there, you know, maybe this is like kind of like, you know, like pie in the sky, but like if your VLMs are potentially good enough, then you don't need to like specify super, super dense rewards for like how did you pick up the drill exactly? Because I think that like unless you have a lot of like actual like targeted data, like motion capture data, it'd be very difficult to do. And so like you know, maybe having like a VLM almost provides some sort of like fine tuning, like guidance of like how to like properly pick up the drill could be useful.
So the role for simulation in this case would be maybe you seed it with some amount of human video or human data. And then in the simulation environment, is it just a case of like just having thousands of different drills, thousands of different screws, you know, and then simulate the hell out of it? And then maybe use a VLM to tell you whether, okay, did you manage to screw into the wood or something like that? Would it be roughly how you...
One of the I think that's definitely a viable way just because with simulation the one thing that you do get is like it's like super cheap and easy to scale. You just spin up a few more GPUs and then you have like a lot more data. But it's like doing everything like RL from scratch is just quite like hopeless. If you want to learn every task from scratch, it's just fundamentally too difficult. And so simulation like definitely has a role, but it probably won't be like to learn the entire task, like every single task from scratch. And I think more likely it would be like, you know, maybe you can do some sort of like upscale pre-training so that you can learn different types of like behaviors like coarsely. And then from there, you can do a whole bunch of fine tuning and simulation, as you said, you know, like different drills, different screws and stuff. But then also you're not just doing like a random walk, which is like the RL from scratch method, but you know, because you've done this pre-train, you've really constrained the sort of like set of trajectories you do, ones that are like actually feasible and going to give you like useful data, which is the way that you can unlock the scale of your simulation.
So yeah, on that note, is there anything stopping you from doing like continuing policy training in the real world or something? Because like you have this the geometric fabrics keep the robot safe, so it's not going to damage itself. That's good. You have a policy which is basically self-resetting because it's just moving things from one place to another. Like, couldn't you do that? I guess is that what? And you have a policy that already works 80% of the time, so it should be able to get a pretty strong signal even with a sparse reward. So like, would that resolve some of these issues, or is there some other obstacle? I guess.
Yeah, I think like with real world RL, like the only difficulty I guess is like how are you able to do like this resetting? But like, or like that's like a big difficulty. But like to your point, like you could probably like design around that for sure.
For picking tasks, I feel like you could design around that at least.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And so yeah, I think like that's a pretty viable thing, especially like as you mentioned, like with the geometric fabrics keeping the robot safe. You might run into some practical limitations where like if you notice in some of our videos we have like the fan because the Allegro actually overheats a lot, and so like we kind of like sometimes have to give it a break and then do our experiments after like 30 minutes and stuff.
There's a video from Encore of that thing, like doing the Rubik's Cube, which you had at the beginning, and there's a version of that that's long enough where it starts to smoke.
Yeah.
You guys got to get a better hand. There are better hands these days. Like,
one of the sort of parts of like the geometric fabrics that makes it a bit more appealing is that it's less likely to be super harsh on the hand, and so it can like lower the amount of the chances that it'll actually start smoking. But even like before you get to that, like when the hand starts to heat up a lot, like it'll perform worse. And so like, you know, I have found when I visited at SRL to like conduct some of these experiments, like just like turn it off, like take a bit of a break for 30 minutes, come back, and then like it'll do a bit better. But yeah, the Allegro hand has been a bit of a bottleneck. So I think always looking for a better hand.
Yeah.
That's the most impressive one I've seen in a while. No, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But yeah. Cool. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, maybe Ritvik, I have another question. Were you involved in the previous work, RGB, the one with the G, the one with the depth?
Yeah, so no, I was only involved with the RGB one, and then Chris mentioned the like Dextream, the one that Ankur had like smoking ants. So I was involved in that one, and then I was involved in basically doing the RGB variant of DextrAH-RGB.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious whether you have some thoughts of, you know, I know that your initial setup is, oh, you know, RGB is easy, cameras are cheap, you know, you can place it easily everywhere, vision is great. But do you really believe that? I mean, you know, like, do you think you continue to just do RGB only because of the reason you stated earlier, or?
Yeah. I do think I actually am like quite bullish on RGB. One of the key differences, improvements compared to DextrAH-RGB was that with DextrAH-RGB, one of the things that, so I wasn't involved, but my co-authors were. And so one of the things that they told me was that for DextrAH-RGB, they would have to have a lot of like boards to block light. And like they would have to like explicitly truncate the depth map and like, you know, tune how like what like to what distance do you truncate the depth map to avoid having external distractor objects, because they would always like corrupt the input depth map. And so I think like in that sense, the RGB actually did, even though like, for example, in some of the controlled settings, like DextrAH-RGB admittedly does do better. In the uncontrolled settings, DextrAH-RGB, they weren't able to really test out DextrAH-RGB with like, you know, arbitrary lights and like distractors because it would mess up like the depth maps. Whereas for RGB, it was like just kind of like a given that you could like do that. It was a lot easier to do. I think also moving forward, when we get to more and more complex tasks, a big challenge is going to be like, what is your perception module? And the benefit of RGB is that you're able to leverage these like pre-trained backbones that are trained on like, you know, huge amounts of data. Like we just use ResNet, which was pre-trained on ImageNet, which is like pretty small in today's day. But like you can imagine like in the future, like being able to leverage backbones from like, you know, like VLMs that are actually trained on truly internet scale data. there just doesn't really exist like similar types of like backbones that I'm aware of, at least. I might be mistaken for depth. And so like the perception part does does become better. And then like the last thing I would say is like if you're like trying to like manipulate in like cluttered scenes or like scenes that have a lot more, it's difficult to get like semantic information from purely depth data. I feel like, especially as you get more cluttered objects and like, you know, there's a bit of noise as well. Whereas for RGB, like it's all just like color intensity. So it's a lot easier to determine like objectness, so to speak. I do think like depth does have like a role to play, and especially like, for example, like in like a simulator, let's say tomorrow I want it's just like simulating realistic rendering is a lot more difficult than simulating depth. But if you learn a depth-based policy, the behavior that you get is something that is very amenable to a vision-based policy because it's aware of the camera. It's like, you know, vision aware and that sort. And so you could then like conceive of a potential like pipeline where, you know, you do RL with depth end to end, but then you distill into RGB, because for depth end to end, like the simulator, just like rendering depth is like so easy compared to rendering like, you know, ray traced and stuff. And so
Yeah,
then you might see some speed ups.
That's a really interesting idea. Coming from the other direction, though, one thing that I did notice about your setup is that it is actually really not taking as much advantage of RGB as it could. Like a lot of these more recent works use like these wide field of view or fisheye cameras to get around a lot of these issues that you had, right? Because like they can take in so much more. They don't have to worry about occlusions as much. They capture like a really nice context. Those Intel RealSenses are so narrow. They see like one thing, right?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Actually, one of the things in our Boston Dynamics work, I don't think we might have. Okay, so in a Boston Dynamics, I think like it was on the Boston Dynamics video. I can't pull it up right now, but it was a Boston Dynamics robot. You can search online. It actually does use that fisheye lens. It was like in the beginning, like I thought like, how much help can like fisheye like really give you, because a lot of these like backbones are trained on like normal rectified images, but the fisheye was actually really, really nice because, as you said, like the FOV was really broad. And it was one of the things I looked into was like, after we did this Boston Dynamics stuff, I thought like, how would it be if we did manipulation on like a G1 Unitree robot? So the G1 doesn't have fisheye. It only has like the singular monocular, like it is an Intel RealSense camera. And one of the immediate things I ran into was like, wow, like the the FOV that you get is super, super narrow. And like, I guess it's like a testament to like, as a human, you don't really like think about it too much, but like the human vision actually has like an incredible FOV. And with like the Boston Dynamics robot, like they're like the fisheye, like it was like really nice to be able to like manipulate like along the whole table. And that was something that I do agree with you, like 100%. That's really useful for RGB, especially manipulation.
Makes sense. I had one last question. I don't know if, but like, I was wondering what happens if you put two objects in front of it?
Yeah, I haven't done that.
Okay.
I imagine it would try to, maybe it'll like just like switch between two. One thing that's like kind of similar was like I tried to put an object onto the table, but I didn't take my hand away fast enough. And so instead of trying to grasp the object, it tried to lift my hand instead. So that was like an interesting thing where like I was moving my hand and then it was actually locked onto my hand and tried to grab my hand instead of the actual robot on the table. But I think for now, I haven't really tested out like explicitly putting like multiple objects on the table. And I think that's definitely something we'd like to do in the future to be able to, you know, grasp and flutter and stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool.
Yeah, so maybe just as a wrap up, usually we like to ask this question, like, are there any cool papers you come across recently that you want to give a shout out to that really like you thought is interesting? Doesn't have to be like manipulation or RGB, like, you know, could be humanoid stuff, like, yeah.
I think So I actually just came back from vacation, so I actually didn't do much reading in the past several weeks.
Oh,
I
no,
think
I mean, mhm.
one of the recent things I thought was like really cool was the paper from Physical Intelligence, their most recent one, where they treated like the diffusion model as kind of like an in-painting problem to make sure that like the future chunks are more consistent with the previous chunks. This is not sim to real at all. It's completely imitation learning, but I thought it was a really cool technique, and I thought it was like cool that they're able to get like, like faster like rollouts because like it's not switching between the different modes, and it's able to commit. And so in general, like I really like these sort of papers that are like taking a lot of the lessons we learned in deep learning and like being able to apply them to robotics.
All right. Thank you so much, Ritvik, for your time today.
Thank you.
Really cool paper. I was very impressed, especially with I think the physical patient is like, I feel that were you the one doing it, but I feel that you were basically losing to the arm. The robotic arm, rather, right? It's like
that was like Carl. So doing like that one, but yeah, it's like towards the end, it would get sometimes difficult to like move it away. And one of the interesting ones is like sometimes like I don't have any videos on me, but I remember Carl, one of the things he would do is he would, for one of the videos, he wouldn't even place the object on. He would just roll the object onto the table. And then like the hand would just like kind of like, it would track and then like pick it up. Because like in simulation, we also apply like random wrenches onto the object. So it has seen objects like randomly moving around, and it's like able to track it. And
it really is impressively fast, I think, for an
it is impressive policy. And a little bit scary towards definitely don't put a baby onto the table. It's just going to
this is running in slow. This is I think running in normal mode or slow mode. There's actually a faster mode that it can run on.
You can literally turn it into a game, man. Like fastest up first, and then see compete against that robot.
Yeah, it's one of the nice things about the fabrics.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, like I said, thank you so much for the time. Okay. Cool. Thank you. All right, Chris, what have you learned?
I thought this was a cool work about stereo vision sim to real. Like, it's always impressive. I think the thing I was super impressed by how fast it was. There's a lot of cool technical details as to how they did things. Like, I think that some of the stuff that they talked about, like the handling, all the domain randomization, handling the variances, the use of the geometric fabrics. It's a very cool system. I don't know. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, like the demo were impressive. I thought, the real world demo.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, I think that there's always this elegance, this simplicity to really truly do things like close to end. So I think that's why it was relatively straightforward for him to swap out a completely different hands, different robot. And probably he don't have to change the pipeline too much. And I think especially maybe in his future work, when he bring in a VLM as to help the reinforcement learning rewards.
Yeah.
Then that loop get even like more self-involved.
Yeah. Yeah, dealing with more cluttered. I'm interested to see how it works with more cluttered scenes and more like incorporating the active perception, like you mentioned. One thing it's interesting with these end-to-end things, how many steps there are in the process. Like, this isn't the most extreme of them, but there's the teacher and all these different parts.
Yeah,
right?
there's teachers and student. And I mean the reward, the reward functions is clearly handcrafted, right?
At least it's very simple. It's but that's because of the geometric fabric. So this is other component. Like, it's a complicated system, but it works really well, it seems like.
I would say maybe for the task itself, it makes sense. Like, he basically has four rewards, right? Getting the hand, don't close too much when you grab that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think a lot of this it's also like what is the reward function to even write it in, and those are mostly hard coded. Only a couple of papers try to do this. Maybe the Eureka paper, was it from John Jason, that tried to use an LLM to go and design. Yeah. So yeah. But once if you set the rewards right, then if a lot of this can be done in simulation, then you just put it out there and it seems real. I mean, it's not perfect. It's a bit surprised by the variance, honestly. Because there's some tasks that is 100% success rate, and there's some tasks that are 40, 20%. And what he said was even more interesting. He was saying that actually some student policy just literally depend on the seat. Actually can be quite good. So it becomes so random. Right? I was like,
yeah.
I'm trying to think, okay, does it mean that you need to just have a mixture of student experts now?
Yeah, I actually think that would probably fix it, because like there's a couple of these other ones that do stuff like that, where like you train separate students for every if you trained a separate student for every object, then distilled them with that like into one policy later, like just add another step to your training process, maybe that would fix it all. Like I don't know. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, but during deployment, how do you know which student is gonna perform well? Like
no. Yeah.
You don't know beforehand, then or rather
this
flip
would
it the
be
other way. If you know it
hypothesis.
beforehand.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, the hypothesis would be that like it's probably, so this is one thing that he was asking, right? That he was mentioning during when we were discussing that, was that there is that he thought he could figure it out if he was like had better statistics on what the different classes were, which implies that what's happening is that like it's assigning some of its like reward mass or weight towards some things and letting others suffer, right? And there's some that are doing well for some objects in simulation. And it's not, so like if it's visible in simulation, then you could probably just train a bunch of them and then you could solve this problem, right? Like, and that's the hypothesis. This is that it's actually like it's learning a certain style of behavior that only works for like 80% of the objects in sim, right? And that I think is very fixable, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Now I don't know if that's true. That's just like my read of what he was saying, right? Like,
yeah. And I guess the other thing is also I don't know how. Yeah, maybe we should ask him just now. Like, how does he define success? Some if it has if the model has good recovery, let's say you fail the first time, you do again, so you give it like up to 10 seconds to grab the thing. I don't know, and then ultimately you grab the thing. Is it still a success even though it failed the first one twice? Yeah. Because if it's failed the first try, but then in the second try you immediately get it, then I think it's okay. It's acceptable in the real world. It's actually probably still okay. Especially his arm is so fast, right? So yeah, I'll be quite surprised if he constantly just don't know how to grab it. I think that would be quite weird to me.
For some small objects, I bet it really just can't do it.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah,
that's true. Like you said, the Lego block.
Right.
Yeah.
But I bet for the objects they were testing on, they were all actually fairly big. So I think you're right. I would be shocked if it didn't succeed eventually, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Because they already got the physical perturbation, and clearly the robot arm wants to do it, keep wanting to do it. So and eventually it does it. So yeah, actually we should ask him that. I wonder whether that's considered success. Yeah. Oh, that's true.
You get like bumpers around the edge of the table or something.
Yeah.
That's the only way it actually fails.
I would consider that the physical perturbation scenario a success, because you're subjecting. I mean, it's almost not fair to the bot, but then eventually you make it, have done. So anyway, so sometimes it could be also just down to how strict he defines success. I mean, all these papers, they all have different way of defining success. So that's the other thing. There's no Anyway, cool. Yeah, I guess that's it for today. Until the next one.
Fun stuff.
All right.
See you next time.